Paul Ekman versus Lisa Feldman Barrett. These two folks are pioneers and legends, really, when it comes to the field of research into emotions. They represent very different ways of conceptualizing emotion. And in this particular video, I'm going to discuss what I have found useful and not useful in their two different frameworks towards emotion. This is Jürgen Rasmussen, by the way. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis channel. Now, I'm not a scientist. I don't do scientific research. I don't work in the lab. So my analysis here and observations are not so much going to be about what seems the most accurate in the scientific sense, although I will go into that a little bit. It's more going to be about what I have found useful in my 26-year long career in seeing clients full time. I spend my days seeing clients who anxietize and who depress and who struggle with chronic pain and jealousy and anger issues and psychosomatic issues. And I've studied the work of both of these folks quite intensively. So it's on the basis of that I'm going to be talking about this from a what have I found useful in their frameworks. So these are my interpretations and therefore quite subjective. Now, here's the interesting thing. The field of psychology at this point does not even have a basic agreement around a simple question such as what is an emotion? So if you look at Ekman versus Feldman Barrett, Ekman has a more essentialist view of emotion, where he views emotions as innate, as pretty much universal, as shared with other mammals, that emotions have distinctive facial expressions, universal facial expressions, at least some of these emotions. And Feldman Barrett has a very different take. So I'm going to read from Ekman's autobiography here and just specify what he means or his criteria for an emotion. So, A, that it has a distinctive universal signal in the face and or voice. So Ekman, in his research, established that there were 7 emotions where facial expressions seemed to be universal. These were happiness, disgust, anger, contempt, surprise, fear, and anger, mostly negative, right? And he would claim that for these universal emotions, that we have the exact same facial expressions for these emotions, irrespective of culture. So Ekman went to Brazil, he went to Argentina, he went to Japan, and claimed to see the exact same facial expressions for these emotions. He also went to Papua New Guinea and spent time with a tribe there that essentially lived the same way that they did in the Stone Age, and which had not really been influenced by Western culture. There had been at least one anthropologist there who worked on the disease called Kuru, who had a lot of film footage. And Ekman got his hands on this footage and realized that, wait a minute, I'm not seeing any facial expressions that I haven't seen before. And if I can see the facial expressions, I can kind of predict what's going to happen next in the film and what the content is. So he thought to himself that he had uh, kind of discovered that Margaret Mead was wrong when she said that emotions are culturally and socially constructed, and that Charles Darwin was right in that emotions are innate. So he went to Papua New Guinea, spent a lot of time with a tribe called the Four People, probably butchering that name. Uh, and he would, through a translator, show people. So he would have six different pictures of happiness, sadness, anger, surprise, disgust. I don't think he had contempt at the time. And he would tell people a story, some sort of story. For example, maybe someone has stolen your food or something like that, and he would have people point at the face that seemed to match the story. And he would also create stories and say, if that was you, which face would you have? And when doing this, he discovered that these four people, for the most part, picked out the same facial expressions as Westerners and the people in Argentina and Brazil and Japan did. So he concluded that we had universal emotions, just like Charles Darwin had said, and that we had the same facial expressions. He also discovered something he called micro expressions and subtle expressions, which would be either partial expressions of that emotion or a very quick expression on the face, maybe 1/4 of a second, where you would see the emotion, and that you could train yourself to spot these micro expressions, and that these micro expressions would often conceal leaked emotions that people didn't necessarily want you to see. Um, so let's see here. Well, presence in other primates. So emotions not unique to humans, just like Charles Darwin and his Sylvan Tompkins, had suggested. There is quite a bit of research. Ekman for a very long time was kind of the gold standard in nonverbal communication, research on emotions, the face specifically, and detecting deception. So there is quite a bit of research to support his position. A lot of peer-reviewed papers. There's another now dead late effective neuroscientist by the name of Jock Panksepp, who claimed to have discovered these emotion circuits, which Ekman also theorized that you would have these specific circuits in the brain distinct for each of these various emotions. Um, Panksepp talked about rage circuits and fear circuits and grief circuits. This all matches onto Ekman, obviously. Seeking circuits, play circuits, care circuits, and lust circuits, right? So there is some overlap there. Another interesting thing is there's a psychopathy researcher who also researches altruism by the name of Abigail Marsh. She's written an excellent book called The Fear Factor, where she writes a lot about how psychopaths, as a group, people who score high on psychopathic traits, uh, have a significantly more sluggish amygdala and a smaller amygdala, and that they respond way less when they see fearful facial expressions, and that the psychopaths have a really hard time detecting facial expressions of fear in someone else's face. Not expressions of anger or happiness and stuff like that, but expressions of fear. And one theory here is that because they are rather fearless and don't feel a lot of it, they have this sluggish amygdala. You know, uh, they're way poorer at detecting this in other people as well. On the flip side, as I said, she studied extreme altruists, people who donate a kidney to complete strangers, and notice that the people who tend to be very altruistic and pro-social have way larger amygdalas and way more responsive amygdalas. And that the people who are the most altruistic and pro-social are not the fearless types, but there often are people who have access to quite a bit of fear. And of course, when she talks about the psychopaths having less ability to read fearful faces, she is referring to the type of alleged fearful faces that Ekman uh, refers to in his research. So let's see, what else here? Well, distinctive physiology that creates and sustains each emotion, which is always something that Jock Panksepp, would claim. Distinctive universals in some of the antecedent events that trigger each emotion. So it's a view that emotions are triggered by events. They're reactions to events, right? And that there is a quick appraisal going on beneath conscious awareness. Very quick. Consciousness is not really involved. So you could say that that kind of seems to be triggered as well. So there's this perception that emotions are innate, they're universal, they have a distinct facial expression, at least 7 of them. They're shared with other animals, and that they are triggered. Let's see what else Ekman has here. Yep, quick onset, brief duration, automatic appraisal, which occurs outside of conscious awareness, unbidden occurrence. And he also writes very few triggers that will always call forth the same emotion in all people. The signal can be suppressed. The signal can, be simulated well enough to mislead most people, and that emotions can be enacted in either constructive or destructive ways. So Ekman made very distinct. These were his criteria for what an emotion is. We'll get back to Feldman Barrett later. And he would distinguish this from cognitions and perceptions and instincts and reflexes, and in his book, things like pain would not at all be an emotion. Now, I read all his books. I watched every interview I could ever find. I've spent a lot of time training myself to spot micro expressions. And I always liked. I always had an issue with this idea that emotions were triggered because I come from an NLP background, and it's always been very clear to me that we're kind of constructing our experience, from how we make meaning, So it's always been very clear to me that emotions aren't really triggered, but they're constructed. But one thing I really found appealing was this idea of patterns, universal facial expressions, and that you could learn to read them and spot them, and stuff like that. Now, the thing that happened for me, though, with Ekman's work is that so when you see clients professionally the way I do, I have a background in neurolinguistic programming, hypnosis, various forms of meditation, various schools of psychotherapy. And I would spend a lot of time watching people in the office talk about, times when they were angry or fearful or sad. I would have them remember memories, imagine being in those situations. I would sometimes take people to elevators or to watch spiders and stuff like that. And I would watch people's physiology. And what really struck me and what really surprised me was that most of the time, people's facial expressions were not aligned with Ekman's theory. Meaning, most of the time when people would remember a time they were scared or imagine being on the plane, or I would take them to the local elevator, if they're claustrophobic, and they would claim to feel the fear in their body, most of the time people would not show the alleged universal facial expression on the time. In fact, more often than not, they would not show this expression, and that mystified me, a lot. Uh, and then something else that happened is I've had the experience multiple times of watching myself on videotape, on vacations and stuff like that, and being struck by how my external appearance does not seem to match my inner state. Meaning, I would see instances where I knew that I was happy and content and feeling really good on the inside, but I would look as if I had the male equivalent of a resting bitch face. And that was kind of jarring because I was like, wait a minute, I know that I was, of course, my memory could be wrong, but I know I was happy in that instance, but my face does not seem to at all show it. It seems to show something else. And I've had this experience socially quite a few times where a lot of people, before they get to know me or after getting to know me, they say, you're actually quite nice, or you have a sense of humor, or I remember one guy I hired about 10 years ago from Uganda who I hired to do some computer work. And he said to me, you have a great sense of humor and you're really nice to be around, and I'm really surprised. And I was like, what do you mean? Well, when I first saw you, you seemed so unapproachable, and I really thought to myself that this is a guy I'm gonna have to call sir, something like that. I remember hearing that and it just being so jarring or not in accordance with how I experience myself. So what occurred to me is that clearly people can have inner experiences does that does not show on their face, right? So that was another kind of nail in the coffin for me regarding the Ekman thing. And of course, Ekman, in addition to anger, fear, sadness, surprise, disgust, and contempt and fear, uh, has acknowledged that people have the capacity to feel certain emotions that don't necessarily show on the face in a universal way, like shame and guilt and embarrassment and stuff like that. So he did kind of expand on his system. Uh, but here's the useful thing that I got out of that, and that is that when people did display, for example, what Ekman would call a fear face or an anger face or a sadness face, if I inquired as to what they were feeling, they almost without exception would always confirm, say, I'm sad or I'm angry or I'm fearful. So in the instances where people do display those facial expressions, they seem to almost without exception actually be feeling or referring to that emotion. Even if I don't ask them, are you afraid? Even if I ask them, what are you experiencing? They would say fear. And, I just recently went on roller coasters with my 5-year-old son, and we were like up in the height, just before the cart kind of descends. And I could see this beautiful facial expression of fear, and when we came down, he told me, yeah, I was really scared, and it started right there, and that was the exact spot where I could see the fearful facial expression. And just the other day too, I was driving outside here, and some teenager was walking in the middle of the street with their phone. I thought, oh, I'm gonna have fun with this. So I honked the horn really hard, and the person, showed this perfect, facial expression of fear. I like doing stuff like that. It's probably not a good thing. Um, but the point being, um, even though Ekman's research is probably far from as accurate and as universal as he claims. There seems to be something to it. And you know, quite often, if I've suggested to clients, let's go to that elevator and let's test, I can see this micro expression of fear, which is then an indicator to do a bit more work perhaps before we go. Or at the end of a session, the client may say that something's resolved or shifted or different, but they may show a micro expression of anger, for example, while saying it. And that's very often a useful cue to me to go, what was that? What happened just there? Or what did you feel right there? Or is there anything that's unsaid? And very often you'll get the admission that, yeah, I still have some anger around this. So that has been useful and still is very useful in terms of future pacing and testing and stuff like that. The drawback is that it's easy to then think that if someone doesn't display that facial expression, that they're not having such an emotion, and that can be a trap. So know that even if someone does not, for example, display what Ekman would call a facial expression of fear, they might still be experiencing fear. Here's something else that I got from Ekman that has been very useful. So Ekman discovered that if you can get someone to voluntarily make the facial expression of, for example, anger, then the emotion will begin to arise. So not only is there a sign on the face when people experience the emotion, according to Ekman, but if you put the face voluntarily in that configuration, people will begin to feel the emotion. Now, I've done this mostly with anger, and it's been very useful when I have had clients who don't have a good felt sense, or people who it's hard for them to use their imagination or their memory to access feelings of anger. I can very often help people access it by having them do the anger facial expression. And what happens then is that there's a shift in physiology. Now, what Lisa Feldman Barrett would claim probably is that, yeah, there's a shift in just body sensations, what's happening in the body, and I would agree. But people can very easily make anger out of those sensations. So as a way to access anger voluntarily, to get to know the sensations, to increase the gap between stimuli and response, this has been a very, very useful tool in my practice. But something else that I discovered with Ekman is that, you know, when this idea that there's a distinct physiology separate, for each emotion. One of the things that I do when I work with clients who may say that, they're anxious or they're depressed or, angry or whatever, is that I'll say to them, look, how do you know that you're anxious? And they might go, well, I panic or I think this. And I go, okay, but the word anxiety, is a concept, refers to something. So what is it that you actually feel? What's going on internally that you label anxiety? And sometimes, people might say, well, my heart starts beating fast, I get sweaty palms, I get a dry mouth, or my legs, get really tense. These are typical. There are often quite typical, but someone else might say, I get air hunger, my breathing is restricted. Or someone else might say, I begin to hyperventilate. Or someone else might say, I get really dizzy. or I get a really strong feeling of just coldness in my body. It's this shivering. Other people might say I get really hot and I start to sweat. Another person might say I get really nauseous. So the point being here that for example, when people say that they feel anxiety, there are some typical candidates. You know, typical ones might be beating heart, sweaty palms, dry mouth, you know, muscle tension, these sorts of things. But I've had many people who say that they're anxious who claim to feel none of that. They don't have a beating heart. They don't have sweaty palms. They don't feel a dry mouth. Uh, they don't feel their legs shaking. They might just say, I have all this tension in the head, you know, and this internal dialogue, where they might say, the main thing is I just get really, really dizzy, and I get this nauseous feeling, or I get this really cold feeling. So that's been interesting to notice, is that there clearly isn't one fear or one anger or one sadness, because if you drill down on the physiology and the sensations that people experience, people can use the same concept word, anxiety, and refer to completely different experiences. So that, I think, is also a huge challenge to Ekman's model. Let's see, what else do I have here? Another thing too. So, and here's something really interesting. If you take away the concept or the story, so let's say someone comes in and they say that they suffer with fear, and you help them evoke that state, right? If you can help them differentiate the story, the concepts from the body sensations, there's no more fear. There's just energy. There's just some movement in the system, right? Which kind of showed me that, look, people can have very different body sensations, and then they use stories and concepts to create an emotional experience out of it. So, for example, um, I worked with a woman very recently who experiences fear when she's flying, or on an airplane, I should say. And when I asked her, what do you experience actually? And beating heart, like strong pulsation and sweaty palms. Now, she exercises every day. She runs and lifts weights and stuff like that. And I had her run on the spot in my office for 30 seconds really intensely and just tune into what she felt. And she felt the exact same stuff. She felt the beating heart and warm, sweaty palms. I said, how scary is that? And she started laughing. And because what she kind of realized is that on the airplane, when she feels a beating heart and sweaty palms, her thinking process makes fear out of it, or anxiety. But while she's running, it does not. So that has to mean that there's no distinct physiology, right? And if we turn to Lisa Feldman Barrett's work, she claims that emotions are not universal. They're likely not shared with other animals. They're not innate. They don't have universal facial expressions. There's no emotion circuits in the brain. There's no distinct pattern identifiable or distinct for different emotions in the body. So what she says is, look, for you to have a particular emotion, you need a concept of it. Now, a concept doesn't have to be verbal. In psychology, a category is a bunch of things or processes that has something in common, And a concept is a mental representation of that, right? But just as I said, if you take away the concept or the story, if someone says they have fear, there's no longer fear. There's just some activity going on, right? So she claims that emotions are actually constructed in the moment. And her to illustrate uh, her model, I'd like to offer a couple of examples from her book, How Emotions Are Made, and also her book, 7.5 Lessons for the Brain. I've read her books too and watched a lot of interviews with her on YouTube. So she writes about, and this is from 7.5 Lessons for the Brain. She writes about this letter that she got from a former soldier in an army in South Africa back in 1970. He was a soldier, and he was out with his comrades tracking guerrilla soldiers very reluctantly because he used to identify with those guerrilla soldiers. He was in the Rhodesian army back in 1970. And then one day, as he was doing exercises with his rifle, and he heard some sounds, he felt his heart racing, he saw something that looked really sharp at a distance, and then he saw a leader, pointing at him with an AK-47 and a bunch of guerrilla soldiers behind him. He felt intense fear, and he aimed his rifle to shoot. And just before he shot, someone tapped his shoulder and said, "Don't shoot. It's just a boy." And then he looked again, and now he suddenly saw that, wait a minute, it was a young boy, maybe 12 years old or something. The AK-47 was actually a herding stick, and the camouflaged guerrilla soldiers were actually a bunch of cows. And this instance had bugged him and tormented him for years, as in, what's wrong with my brain? How could my brain make that out of that? But Lisa Feldman Barrett says that, look, one of the main reason we have a brain is to regulate the body. So the brain regulates the body and sends signals to the body, and the body sends signals back. And what the brain is doing is regulating the metaphorical body budget, right? And based upon all the stuff that's going on in the body, the signals that the brain gets from the body, it gets a sort of summary that we feel as affect. And in affect, we have things like valence, comfortable, uncomfortable, pleasant, unpleasant, calm, agitated, and arousal, the level of intensity or calmness and effort and stuff like that. So this affect is kind of a summary readout of the body budget or the state of the body. It's an interpretation, obviously. And that what we have a tendency to do then is, depending upon the context, our minds create different stories and concepts of what these sensations mean. So if you and that what our brain is doing, it's actually constantly predicting. So in the case of the body, it's trying to predict in advance, how much glucose, how much salt, how much oxygen, do we need more cortisol, using a combination of sensory data hitting the sensory surfaces and memory. So it's trying to predict. So it's kind of asking a question like, well, given what I know about this war, and me being out here with my comrades and having a rifle in my hands and feeling a beating heart, so combining what I know about the war and the state my body is in, What am I likely to perceive or experience next? And it's that prediction that creates your emotions and in his case the perception of the guerrilla soldiers. And in this case, luckily, there was new information from the outside that was able to correct his predictions. She has another really interesting example in the book of working at a lab when she was single, and this guy there trying to pick her up and who was interested in her romantically and inviting her out on a date, and she would say no, but one day she kind of gave in and but wasn't really interested, probably just exploited him for food or something like that, and they went to this restaurant, and during the dinner date, uh, I can't quite remember the sensations she referred to, but I think her face got a bit flushed and she felt a bit spaced out and she kind of felt a bit self-certain, self-conscious and jittery in the body, stuff like that. And as a result of feeling those sensations in a context that was potentially romantic, her brain created the emotion of or the experience of attraction out of it. It's not that she's tricked, it's a genuine, and she ended up dating the person for 9 months. But her point being that, so let's say for example you have a tug in the stomach, you know, that on a date a brain can create attraction out of that. Or if you're part of jury service, for example, the brain can create an experience of, I think that witness is lying or not being truthful. Or in some other context, let's say before an exam or a job interview, the same tug in the stomach could easily be performance anxiety. Just like with my client who, in one context, exercise, she has the beating heart and the sweaty palms, and she does not create fear out of it. But on the airplane, she experiences the same sensations, but her mind creates fear out of those sensations. Um, I think that this is way more accurate. I think it's way more accurate, and I think it's a way more useful approach. And specifically, if you look at, for example, people with chronic pain, if you look at someone with phantom limb pain, they may have, lost their leg 10 years ago. If the pain, at least Feldman Barrett, by the way, describes pain as an emotion, versus, of course, Ekman does not do that. But but obviously, if the pain was in the leg, the pain should have left when the leg was amputated. But there's pain, so neutral, benign sensory data is hitting the brain, but the brain is interpreting those as threatening and predicting pain when doing certain movements or and there's this loop between what you could call anxiety and pain all the time. So chronic pain, we know today in most instances is neuroplastic. It's generated by the brain. It's a prediction problem. That the brain is predicting that when I do that golf swing or when I bend over to touch my shoes, that means pain. The last time I was in this situation with this golf swing, moving that way, I had that intense pain, and the brain predicts that and enacts that, but the experience is constructed. And the same goes with anxiety and all these other. So it's extremely useful because what you then can do is, and you can do this through meditation or mindfulness or what I teach, the psychological illusion model, or many other ways of working, is that you can help someone to kind of separate the concepts and drill down on the actual uh, body sensations and discover that in and of themselves, they may have an affect component to them in being intense or not intense or pleasant and unpleasant, but they're kind of neutral. You can create pain out of them. You can create fear out of them. You can create all sorts of experiences. I do the same thing with people with migraines, people with allergies, how people can create allergic responses out of certain sensations going on or not as they discover with experiences of anger. So it's great to help people to discover that uh, the sensations themselves are neutral, meaning given a particular set of sensations, there's no mandatory emotion that you have to have. Of course, you can help people to discover the same thing with thinking and perceiving as well, that the thought itself is neutral. Neutral in the sense that even if you have a particular thought, you don't have to, excuse me, you don't have to have a particular emotional experience to make out of it. In the same way that because you have a particular thought, you don't have to have a particular behavioral response. But in psychotherapy, and the people in metacognitive therapy call this for thought fusions, right? People people live and feel and act as if because I have this thought that says I need to check the stove or get out of the room, I have to check the stove. Or because I have this particular thought or image, I have to freak out and panic. Or because I have this particular feeling or thought, I have to have all this rumination and worry about it. And we actually don't. It's perfectly neutral. But Lisa Feldman's views on constructed emotion is a great framework that offers kind of the scientific backing and many analogies and metaphors to help people to make those sorts of discoveries. Now, something really interesting that she says there is you can't really experience an emotion without the concept. So that would dispute the idea that our dogs or cats, for example, necessarily make emotions in the same way that we do because they don't have the same concepts, right? Whereas Ekman and Panksepp and these folks would claim that these are innate. Of course, I can't really claim to know because I can't really talk to a dog or get access to their experience. But she uses a couple of interesting thought experiments that philosophers and teachers of cognitive psychology often use. And these are stories. So for example, if I show you this and I ask you, is this book read? Or if we both left the room, and the book kind of disappears, from sight, is it still read? The common sense answer is yes, of course, but the scientific answer is actually no. The object isn't red. The object reflects light, and a certain wavelength of light, hits the retina at, somewhere between 400 and 750, nanoseconds. I can't quite remember. Uh, and then the brain's activity with the concept of red is needed for you to have the experience of red. You know, Feldman Barrett talks about a particular tribe in Papua New Guinea where what we, an apple that we would experience as red, they would experience as brownish of sorts because they have different concepts. Or another typical riddle that is often used is the one of, if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to hear it, does it still make a sound? And of course, the common sense answer is, yes, of course. But all that's really happening are changes in, airwaves and ear pressure that hits the ear. For you to have an experience of it, you need to have an ear, you need to have a brain that can generate sound out of it, and you need the concept of a tree and what a tree can do to have that particular experience. Um, so let's see what else we have here. Uh, yeah. Something else that I found useful. Uh, by the way, Ekman, of course, views emotions as different from cognitions and perceptions, and he thinks that emotions have evolutionary adaptive functions. Feldman Barrett does not really make a distinction between emotions and perceptions and cognitions, and doesn't really speculate into why we really have conscious experiences of emotion to begin with. But listen to this, and this is from her book, How Emotions Are Made. By the way, they both also make a distinction between emotions and moods, where Ekman is very clear that emotions are useful, but if he could do away with moods, he would. And of course, Feldman Barrett kind of refers to affect in a sense that affect is always there and it's kind of innate, but that emotions aren't. But listen to what qualifies as emotions in Feldman Barrett's words. So she talks about how different cultures then can have very different experiences or different emotions because they have different concepts. So gigil in the Philippines, the urge to hug or squeeze something that is unbearably adorable. Voorpret, Dutch, pleasure felt about an event before the event takes place. Age otori, I probably butchered that one, Japanese, the feeling of looking worse after a haircut. In her book, these are emotions. Um, and one thing that she suggests that I think is a really great idea is that you can have if you want more emotional, let's call it mastery or richness, you can have that by learning new concepts, by learning new words, by having different experiences, by traveling. You can dramatically improve your emotional life. And she has this very interesting suggestion in the book because she talks about soldiers who are not psychopathic, allegedly, but that some of them sometimes feel a sense of pleasure when killing, in combat, and that they are later sometimes very disturbed by this. And she proposes that if we could teach them an emotion concept like legit, I'm probably butchering that one as well, that could really help. So I'm going to quote from Lisa Feldman Barrett's book here. Um, you're probably unfamiliar with an emotion called legit. It's a feeling of exuberant aggression experienced by a headhunting tribe from the Philippines called the Ilongot. Legit involves intense focus, passion, and energy while pursuing a hazardous challenge with a group of people who are competing against another group. The danger and energy instill a sense of togetherness and belonging. Legit is not just a mental state, but a complex situation with social rules about which activities bring it on and when it is appropriate to feel and how other people should treat you during an episode. To a member of the Ilongot tribe, legit is every bit as real an emotion as happiness and sadness are to you. Westerners surely do experience pleasant aggression. Athletes feel it in the heat of competition. Video games players cultivate it during first-person shooter games. But these people are not experiencing legit with all its meaning, prescribed actions, body budget changes communication and social influence unless they can construct legit using conceptual combination. Legit is the whole conceptual package, and if your brain cannot make the concept, you cannot experience legit. Only you can experience parts of it. And what she proposes is, let's say that you could teach this concept to soldiers. And in that way, they could have the experience, the emotion of legit in a framework that, as a soldier in a particular context, would no longer make the fact that you feel pleasure when killing someone else a problem. It's an interesting application. I should say one more thing. Of course, Feldman Barrett has a competing framework. A few years ago, she and four other scientists spent 2.5 years studying facial expressions and going over more than 1,000 research pages. And these were emotion researchers from different frameworks and schools. And they concluded that there was no universal facial expressions. Members of Barrett's team have gone to Tanzania and other parts of Africa and spent times with tribes and claim that Ekman's findings do not hold up. There's another psychologist by the name of, I think his name is Crivelli, who also spent to an island outside of Papua New Guinea, who was also unable to replicate Ekman's findings, and also went to Mozambique and was unable to replicate it there as well. So at the end of the day, my personal take is I would study both. I would look into Lisa Feldman Barrett's work. I think it's more useful and more accurate. I think there's something to Ekman's work. I do think that some of these emotions are probably pretty universal, but I think that the findings are less strong than Ekman claims them to be. They both seem to be materialists. They both seem to think that consciousness is generated by the brain. When I read their books, that seems to be taken completely for granted. What's really funny about that is, of course, there's no evidence to support that notion. The idea that dead matter somehow gives rise to the experience of being is a unproven hypothesis. Could easily be the other way around. Here's an implication for therapists, though, at the end of it. When Ekman did his work with the Four tribe in Papua New Guinea, he would have a forced choice where he had pictures, 6 different pictures, and he would tell a story and ask people to select the picture that they felt matched the story. And by doing that, he claimed to discover that emotions were universal. But when other people have attempted to replicate his work and they have instead not used the forced choice but asked, what is this person experiencing? The rates really plummet. Especially so in other cultures, but also in the Western culture. So I think to any therapist, or coach, there's a huge implication there in that Ekman may have messed this up by framing it in such a way and by suggesting it in such a way, a bit like police officers in the States often do when they have a lineup and they kind of offer whoever they think are guilty and a bunch of other people who are extremely unlikely, and out of these choices, who's the bad guy. By framing it like that, you get way more hits than if you just say, do you see the person here? open-endedly. So there's a staggering implication there in terms of the power of framing and suggestion and influencing how people answer and what people claim to see. I'm a little bit disappointed in Paul Ekman, I have to say. I mean, to me, he seems to be a guy with strong ethics and good morals, and he seems to have a good head on his shoulder. I, I haven't really seen him respond to criticism from people like Lisa Feldman Barrett and others, or from people like Timothy Levine when it comes to his claims around detecting deception and stuff like that. Um, there's a short blog on Ekman's page regarding Lisa Feldman Barrett, but he doesn't really go into it. So I really would have hoped to see a debate or to see Ekman uh, respond to the criticism against his work and its failure to replicate. And of course, it's not just Lisa Feldman Barrett. There's a bunch of people who have tried to replicate his work, and it doesn't seem to replicate that well. And especially just how powerful and influential Ekman's work has been on our culture, right? It's just enormous. So I'm kind of disappointed by that. Regarding Lisa Feldman Barrett, her science may be impeccable for all I know. I'm not a scientist. When I read her books and watch her talks, to me she comes across very much like an activist in a sense. Of course, they both lean to the left politically, and Ekman seems to be more like a center left guy, like a social democrat. Feldman Barrett, I get more of that feminist vibe. A lot of when she talks about the legal system, for example, she talks a lot about racism and sexism and these sorts of things. And she has a huge chapter in her book about law, emotion and law. And I was kind of disappointed in that if you look at what has to be a great contender for the biggest scandal in psychology, it has to be the repressed memory wars of the late 80s and early to mid late 90s, uh, where so many people were sold the idea of repressed memories and therapy, and during the therapy process discovered both emotions and memories of sexual abuse that they didn't know about the before the therapy. And these, according to memory researchers, these memories are most likely false. Uh, but this theory, which was often sold by psychologists who had a kind of neo-Freudian and a kind of feminist slash bent, has contributed to ruining so many lives. And so many families have been torn apart by accusations. A lot of people have been charged and have innocently spent time in prison for sexual abuse they had not committed on a grand scale. And for Lisa Feldman Barrett to write about emotion and memory and the legal system and to not even mention this seems a little bit odd. Could it be that it kind of clashes with her feminist agenda because some of the most of the people who were charged and spent time in prison and who were accused were in fact men? I begin to wonder, and also the article she wrote in 2017 that's been widely circulated, where she argued that people like Milo Yiannopoulos should not be platformed, and 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 that some forms of speech is violence. That free speech, pure free speech in a sense, is violence. That's really disappointing coming from a scientist, but because without free speech, you don't have science, you don't have journalism, you don't really have critical thinking. And she made the argument of if words can cause stress, and of course they don't, right? It's our interpretation. If words can cause stress, and stress over time, with inflammation and stuff can damage our health, then words then can be a form of violence. But I think Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt had an excellent response to this in Coddling of the American Mind, where they said, look, if you take the idea that A causes B causes C, you just change the content and you say, look, breaking up with your girlfriend or firing someone or flunking a student on an exam can cause, in quotation marks, stress, which over time then can damage the body. Yes, the physiological consequences, but breaking up with someone or flunking a student on an exam is not violence, and neither are words violence. So that's a bit disappointing, and I mention it because when people get it just makes me wonder um, how much the kind of radical left agenda influences her scientific interpretations. Um, Anyways, but her books are excellent. I highly recommend buying them. Watch her on YouTube. I also recommend reading all of Ekman's stuff. It's really interesting stuff. Again, experiment, play, see what you find, see what you get out of it. You may have noticed that I mentioned Jock Panksepp. Uh, I've read some of his stuff, but I haven't studied him to the depth that I have with Ekman and Feldman Barrett. There's an excellent debate on YouTube between Lisa Feldman Barrett and Mark Solms, who's a neuropsychiatrist from South Africa and a student of Jack Panksepp. I highly recommend that you watch those and make up your own mind to what extent you think that Panksepp's work seems to support the idea of innate universal emotions. I hope these reflections were useful to you and inspiring to you. Um, I'd love to hear your thinking. If you think I'm wrong, if you think I'm getting something wrong or right, or I'd love to hear your experiences and your thoughts around this. Um, if you'd like to make some changes and explore and see if you and I could be a good match in terms of working together, you can find me at provocativehypnosis.com. If you're watching this in 2023, there are some seminars coming up in the new year. You can watch the seminar sites. Anyways, thanks for listening.